Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us today for this roundtable discussion on climate change and national security. So my name is Zach Miller. I'm the program coordinator at Most Policy Initiative.
Good.
If I could please have everybody themselves, or Alex, maybe if you can.
How's it going?
Missouri Science and Technology group, and I may not be able to stay on. I didn't know if it was something you guys were interested in. Are you doing much with climate change?
To everyone who is on the call, please mute yourself if you have not already. Thank you very much. Throughout this call, if you guys have any questions for the panelists or for the moderators or for either of our institutions, please drop those in the chat and we will try to get them answered towards the end of the call. My name is Zach Miller and I am the program coordinator at Most Policy Initiative. Our organization is a nonpartisan nonprofit whose mission is to promote long-term health, sustainability, and economic growth for all Missourians by connecting science and policy at local and state levels. So we're housed out of Jeff City and we work in the capital most often, but we also participate in community efforts like this one to share information with all Missourians. So we do not participate in any policy advocacy. Instead, we aim to be honest brokers of quality information to inform evidence-based decision-making in Missouri. And today, this roundtable is co-hosted by the WashU Climate Change Program, which draws together faculty, students, administrators, and community colleagues to promote climate action and to serve as an interdisciplinary resource for climate research and curriculum. They develop collaborations between students, faculty, and the greater community to prepare better leaders for tomorrow. And overall, these roundtables, we host them to introduce folks to locally relevant policy topics from multiple disciplinary perspectives, to give participants new tools for engaging in evidence-based policymaking decisions, and to facilitate connections between our organization, researchers, community partners, and policymakers across the state. Today, our topic is climate change and national security, and I'm really excited to have that we have great panelists with us today. The first panelist that we have is Dr. Jason Knopf. He is a researcher with the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. He's also a professor of biology at St. Louis University and an expert consultant in water and climate security with the U.S. Department of State. We also have Dr. Barbara Shaw, who was a member of President Obama's Council of Advisors for Science and Technology from 2009 to 2017. And she is currently the Mary Dell Chilton Distinguished Professor of Biology at Washington University in St. Louis. And lastly, we have Dr. Wyatt Thompson, who is a professor in agricultural and applied economics associated with the Food and Agriculture Policy Research Institute, or FAPRI, at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And today we are lucky enough to have with us Dr. Melissa Flagg, who is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research and also an expert consultant in national security. And she will be moderating our discussion today. So I will go ahead and pass the microphone over to Melissa, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Zach. It is such a pleasure to be here today. It's really exciting for me to look around at this panel and see such an incredible intersection between national and international activities and sort of leadership in some of the topics that we're going to talk about today, both climate change and national security, as well as people who are located in and committed to and focusing on Missouri as well. I think sometimes we separate the domestic and the international. We tend to make national security a topic that's looking outward. We also have a tendency in traditional discussions of national security to militarize the conversation very quickly. That is mostly my history. I've spent most of my career working in the Department of Defense and Navy, Army, at the Pentagon, and I have a strong sort of knowledge and respect for that. But I also feel like it's really important to remember that national security has the word national in it as well. And we are actually focused on securing the welfare of our citizens and of folks across the United States. And we also live in a moment of really complex challenges. And so thinking about the things that actually create instability in the world and actually create instability in our own country, many of those things map their way back to people feeling secure in their necessities, feeling secure in their water, feeling secure in their food supply, feeling secure in their environment, and being able to cope and be resilient to natural disasters and even man-made disasters, right? Community resilience. And so I think that this idea of actually bringing climate change more into the conversation of national security is critical. And I cannot imagine a better group of people to help us do that today. So with that, I'm going to get off the stage because I'm not the one you came to hear today. And I am going to actually ask each of our panelists first to give a little bit of perspective from their own expertise about how they think about national security and how they think about their sort of topic of interest within that context of national security, just so we orient ourselves a bit in this conversation. Then we're going to move through a little bit of discussion of what some of these topics mean at the national level. And I think we'll open that to some international interactions as well. I don't want people to feel constrained. But then I'd like to bring that down to what that actually means for Missouri and why folks that are sitting in Missouri both should care, but also how can they begin to think about how they interact in this larger space. And then eventually we'll move on to, at the end, if we have a little bit of time left, we're not here to make recommendations. We're not here to solve everyone's problems, but I do think many of us are aware of some of the approaches people are taking to tackle some of these issues. And we'll sort of circle back to maybe just making folks aware of some of the ideas in this space around solutions, as well as what are some resources that people can reach out and look at if they are seeking different types of options in this space to actually try to tackle a problem. So with that, kind of orienting us, giving us a map to use for the conversation. If you don't mind, I'm going to turn it over to Jason to kind of kick off. How do you orient yourself within the national security space?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I'm happy to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity. And I think your introduction was spot on. And so I deal mostly with water issues and how humans impact freshwater resources, particularly related to climate. And so when I think about national security, ultimately what I think about is the preservation of democracy. And so, one of the fundamental aspects of that is having social stability, which is, Melissa, what you referred to. And, when it comes to water, there's really nothing more important, immediately important to social systems than water. So, if our energy is disrupted, we can move on, for weeks or months at a time. If our food systems are disrupted, our resilience to that is not quite the same, but we can handle that for a couple of weeks. But if our water systems are disrupted, then we're talking about 24 hours without water, and things get really serious and really bad. And so as a society, particularly in the U.S., we expect that our governments can provide clean water. We turn on our tap and we see the water. And so when we see disruptions in water systems, then one of the immediate impacts of that is, it fosters a lack of distrust in the government. We think like, well, if the government can't provide this most basic of necessities, what else can it do? And then when that happens, people become disengaged with democratic processes, and that leads to social instability and political instability, which are both threats to national security. So I really, I'm certainly biased, but I see water as really one of the things at the core of our national security.
Thanks, Jason. Barbara, would you like to give us some perspective?
Certainly, and I'm really delighted to be here and appreciate the opportunity to interact with everyone. Climate security risks, I think we all know what they are. There's the impacts on food and water, as Jason has just said, and energy supplies, and then competition over natural resources, and climate-related disasters and migration, displacement, and the social instability, the loss of democracy. I think Jason made a very important point. I'd like to set this into context a little bit. The way that I look at national security, I divide it into the domestic versus the international climate security risks. And of course, this is an arbitrary division because what happens internationally ultimately, in fact, can affect us in a domestic sense. Specific risks obviously have very specific patterns. The melting permafrost doesn't particularly affect Missouri, but it affects indigenous villages in Alaska. And also in terms of military, our radar installations and our national security at that level. And so a lot of these issues seem sort of straightforward at first, really are not. When I think about climate risks to our national security, I think about how these climate aspects, how they affect the United States as a nation. For example, the effect on our government, the well-being of our citizens, our national economy, those domestic impacts. At the international level, which I don't think are foremost right here for this afternoon, those are the risks to security to the US as a nation state. So in this sense, it deals with international issues, climate effects that can destabilize countries due to climate-induced changes in land use, leading to food, water, and energy shortages. That generates geopolitical instability. Examples are the Arab Spring, which was ignited by food prices due to poor harvest related to drought, and then, of course, social instability due to governments. We expect to see international conflicts due to water issues. We see that in Asia already. The issue of climate refugees is one. Emerging infectious disease is something that we're all very interested in, and that clearly has an international and a very strong domestic component to it. So to me, the climate security issues really transcend boundaries, and they can have a potential direct effect on the US and even here in Missouri. But we're also looking at national security more in a domestic sense, but there's this large set of international issues as well that impinge on us. So that's what I have to say at this point.
Thank you. Wyatt?
Thank you, Melissa. So like Zach said when he was introducing most, the role of my research institute is to provide objective analysis to support decision-making. So we think about how shocks or policy changes affect agriculture commodity markets, the producers, the consumers, quantities and prices, and so on. So it's often really not my goal to define the policy issue at stake. It's really the audience. So for example, during the pandemic, we worked with DHS to study the effects of the pandemic, and they were keen to know, how this shock to this food distribution system was affecting the food availability, the prices, how it varied by commodity. You might remember stories about animals and animal slaughter and meat provision. You might remember stories about toilet paper from the pandemic. There were certain topics that were keen to them that from which I might, I understand their definition of national security and what they were keen to see, food availability, food prices, and so on. And that does seem a constant thread during the pandemic around the world of what does this do to the availability of food to consumers and the prices consumers pay? Does it increase food insecurity? So our audiences gave us that signal when they asked us for analysis about those effects. And for climate change, you can imagine maybe some of the same topics. If there are disruptions to production or distribution systems, how does that affect the producers of the commodities? How does that affect the consumers? What are the risks to food security and so on? And it might be a question about the price levels, the price variability, and how the system can withstand new or different shocks going forward. Thank you again, Melissa.
Thank you. I think it's really exciting to hear you add this kind of element of supply chains into this conversation, because I think this is something we're hearing so much about. It's also something that I think is really interesting of what's happening in Missouri, in that the NIST extension program has actually started to try to understand manufacturing supply chains in Missouri. I'm quite keen to start to see us talk about understanding food supply chains and other things like this in this larger discussion and not segregating manufacturing off. And I think this is an opportunity to kind of bring a way to bring this into this conversation is through this umbrella of national security. So I'm very excited to hear you mention that. And something where I think the Midwest in general, they do have a unique kind of opportunity and also set of impacts. So hopefully we can get more to that as we go through the conversation. So let's actually get a little bit more specific now. I think we've had, we've kind of given everybody the orientation, but maybe we'll just circle back around to you, Jason, and say, so specifically when you think about freshwater systems in the US, I think a lot of us in our minds, we're thinking about Jackson, Mississippi, right? Or even Flint, Michigan. These are things that are in the news, but when you specifically look at climate change, how do we need to think about ways that climate change is likely to affect those freshwater systems?
Right. Yeah. And so, with climate change, I think rightly so, people often, initially focus on temperature. And so we've got these increases in air temperature. But of course, the thing that goes hand in that is changes in patterns in precipitation. And both of those things, temperature and precipitation, come together to influence our freshwater systems and how much water is moving through the systems and how quickly that water is moving through. And the real hallmark of climate change that we're seeing now and we expect to see in the future is greater variability. And so we're going to get more flooding, more droughts, more extreme flooding, more extreme droughts. And this is what we're looking to in the future. And every once in a while, you'll hear somebody say, well, we had this big flood. This is the new normal with climate change. And so I always like to say this is actually not the new normal. Next year is going to be different. The year after that's going to be different. And the year after that's going to be different until we get our emissions under control and figure out a way to sort of stabilize our climate. And so the problem that we're seeing is that we're going to get more extreme floods, more extreme droughts, and we're not going to be sure when they're coming. And so most of our social systems, our economic systems, our agricultural systems, are keyed on the timing of certain events. And, a wetter spring, rationing water in the summer. And so these are the challenges that we're facing with this more variable environment and this more variable water environment in the future. And, water touches pretty much everything we do, whether, we initially, we've got drinking water, but, it influences our food systems, our energy systems, our supply chains. And so, as our water availability changes, it's going to pretty much affect everything. And a couple examples, I think we need to look globally to understand what's happening locally, learn what's already happened. So, and last summer, and I'm sure Wyatt and Barbara can talk more about this, but, the Mississippi was as low as it's ever been. And, that disrupted supply chains, distributing grains from Illinois. And at one point, I think it was caused a 300% increase in the cost of moving agricultural products from St. Louis down to the Gulf of Mexico. Just for, perspective, last summer in China, they had such droughts that it disrupted their hydroelectric production, which shut down entire cities, and it shut down the Volkswagen plant, the Tesla plant, a bunch of automotive suppliers, which caused disruptions to supply chains. And so we're seeing, those types of economic disruptions. And then, any sort of localized flooding and displacement of people is what we're seeing. So, I mean, it really, the thing that's challenging about water is it touches everything. And so as water becomes more uncertain, we're going to see our ability to respond to changes in climate challenged again and again. And I think that's really the thing that I'm thinking about most often.
When you talk about greater variability, it sort of feels like that's likely to be a theme throughout this conversation, right? I think another point you make that I find interesting, and Barbara, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as you give us some perspective, I think more specifically on like beyond these structured water and food systems, the rest of the natural environment. I mean, these changes and effects, they also have big effects on, I think, individual citizens, right? And so understanding that is really useful. But also this idea that even an effect on water systems in China can have a directly local effect on the price of goods in Missouri. And this is something that I think, again, these close intersection or this sort of intertwined supply chain that is quite opaque to most individual people, although I would say less opaque post-pandemic, is very interesting. And this idea that can you actually separate local from global becomes, I think, much more intriguing. Barbara, what are your thoughts?
Well, I absolutely agree. It's very hard to differentiate local from global in many cases because everything is interconnected. In particular, I'm interested in biodiversity, which is, I think everyone knows this, the kinds and the numbers of living things on Earth and their habitats and the ecosystems where they live. And the reason that I'm concerned, and many people are concerned about ecosystems, is because they provide ecosystem services. And this is something that is very, very strongly affected by changes in the environment. So global climate change, in fact, puts stresses on our native biological systems. So in the United States, and of course in countries such as Brazil and in many regions, there's large ecosystems. And what they provide are a host of services, and agricultural systems, the same sort of thing. They deal with soil health. They maintain soil health. They flow nutrients. Nutrients flow through ecosystems. There's a flow of energy and matter, water cycling to the atmosphere and back, and that affects the global climate. Water filtration, carbon sequestration is a huge aspect, sometimes a controversial one about what ecosystems do, and then more localized things such as pollination. So the goal is to preserve these services, and sometimes they're really not so apparent. We know that when the Mississippi gets very dry, we can see the aspects of that when the water levels go down. It's much more subtle with ecosystem services. So climate change is a risk to our biodiversity, which is in those ecosystems, and to the benefits that we gain. It's in a local level within Missouri, and it's of course in a national level and international. And one of the challenges is because there's so much interconnection. When we think about a native ecosystem, a forest or a prairie, the species are connected to each other. There's this incredible web of interconnection, and the various components rely on each other. So it's sort of like a ball of string. If you pull one string, other things move across the entire globe. So, and they can be very subtle. There was a really interesting article in the newspaper over the weekend about a rare rabbit species in one of the islands between Taiwan and Japan. And it turns out that there's a parasitic plant that lives there, and it produces these strawberry-like fruits. And by setting up cameras, they were able to show that the rabbits, in fact, eat these fruits. The fruits are then passed through the digestive system, and then they maintain the parasitic plant. Well, the parasitic plant is a member of all of this ecosystem under the soil that connects all the plants in a forest ecosystem. So just the fact of this bunny, this rare bunny, and is really essential for maintaining an ecosystem. And that's the challenge that we face, of course, in the United States and also globally. So the concern that we have is that the change in the environment may be so great that it really exceeds the adaptive capacity of particular species, critical species to adapt, and the capacity of an ecosystem to mitigate the environmental and biological changes.
It's interesting. We don't tend to have a problem thinking about systems level thinking when it's something like a plane, right? We understand that like all the parts of the plane need to work in order for me to get lift, to go up safely and to come down safely. But for some reason, when we look at the natural environment, we have a much harder time taking this systems thinking approach and recognizing that if you go too far out of balance, the plane doesn't fly, or it flies, but it can't land. Or it's not resilient to shock in the same way, right? Like turbulence brings it down. And I think, again, we have a much easier time thinking about this in engineered systems with blueprints, and a much more difficult time thinking about it in these natural systems. I love the way you described that, Barbara. And I think there's probably more conversation to be had around specifically for Missouri. What are the elements maybe that are under threat and that we're losing? And maybe we can come back to this a little bit in the conversation. Wyatt, how would you like us to think about food security? I think you've yours touches on all of it, as they all do, I guess.
So you talked to Melissa about the distribution system of food being opaque, and it certainly is complicated, but I wouldn't want it to be inferred that's monolithic, right? It's a very complicated system that has a lot of decisions in it by a lot of people. It's not designed, but it's organized in the sense through price signals and people's interactions. And again, if you think about the pandemic, in the span of just a few weeks, all of the food that people were buying in restaurants, almost all of it, stopped. And the system had to reorient from delivering certain sizes and certain ways to restaurants to delivering food at home. It was not costless. It was not painless. But that was a huge transition that people shouldn't forget, that system, with cost, with pain, made. The US-China trade war is an interesting example. For Missouri in particular, soybeans is a big crop in Missouri, and China was #1 world importer of soybeans. So a huge amount of US soybeans went to the Pacific Northwest. China stopped importing soybeans from the US. So all of those soybeans, not all, but a huge amount of soybeans was reoriented from going out the Pacific Northwest to going through St. Louis and through New Orleans, maybe, or through the Northeast. There was a huge shift in the soybean flows in the country that had a big impact on the St. Louis area. And also there was a timing difference because South American crop and North American crop happen at different times of the year. One's autumn, is the other spring. And so there's a huge transition of time and space that the system handled, and it was not costless. It was not painless. US soybean farmers lost, their price went down relative to going world price during that period. There was cost and pain. And with climate change so far, we can also see there are changes being made. The agriculture sector is oriented towards signals and incentives, and there have been signals and incentives. So 10 years ago, I remember an extension of comments from Iowa. I'm sorry to Joel Anderson on the chat. I don't have a Kansas example, but from Iowa, talked about how because of the heavy rainfall events of the sort that Jason referred to earlier, point out because he's above me on my screen, I'm sorry. The sort that Jason referred to on my screen, these sorts of heavy rainfall events, farmers were doing more tiling to handle the water better without so much erosion. They were getting, and there was an incentive to get bigger machinery. So when it was dry out, they could go out and get more done on the dry when the weather was right to plant. And doing things trying to address the risk of excessive moisture in crops after harvest. So they were already taking steps a decade ago on this. And here in Missouri as well, I've heard of people working to improve the water handling on their land. People are not passive and just letting things happen. And these are certain levels of change over a certain time period, whereas Jason and Barbara have talked about much bigger changes and maybe over a longer time frame. So whether these are good signals that, oh, we're all going to be okay. No. All these things happen with cost and pain. I don't want to understate the risks, but I also don't want to think that it's just going to happen without any responses. The longer growing conditions in the U.S. have helped to explain why there's more corn grown in North Dakota now than decades ago. Planting can't happen earlier in parts of the U.S. now because of global warming, which is a change. I'm not saying good or bad, just a change. So I just be careful to remember, people aren't passive. People see these incentives and they are taking steps as well.
I love this as a jumping off point for really focusing in on Missouri. And I think the types of impacts that people can expect to see here, but also I think Wyatt, what you really point out is, and I will just say, until recently, my family owned a cotton soybean farm in Arkansas for many years, and we recently sold it. And I now own land up in Randolph County. But it was really fascinating to watch the things that my dad did to that land to try to maintain it over time, and how we changed, kind of moving away from more cotton and into other things as the conditions just became more reliable for other things, right? And we actually got out of corn altogether, and I don't know, whatever. We did several things. My dad was really into it. When my dad passed away, it turned out that raising a nuclear engineer and someone who worked for the military wasn't very helpful for farming. And so I think I'm a cautionary tale that maybe we're losing some adaptive skills. But I do think it's really interesting to think about the fact that we are adapting, right? It doesn't actually mean that things are okay, but what are some of the steps or just some of the evolutions that we see happening in Missouri in all of these systems, right? In how we interact with our water systems, with our food systems, our agricultural systems, as well as our biodiversity and natural environment that's supporting all of these systems and interacting with it? Because I do think that it's easy to say, well, everything's so global that there's nothing I can really do in Missouri for Missouri food security, or there's nothing I can really do in Missouri for Missouri water security. And I don't really believe that's true. So I think I would love it if we could go around and if you guys could maybe chime in with what you're thinking about really specifically for Missouri, maybe what's happening, what examples we have, things that you think are important or thoughtful, or resources that you might point people towards. Anybody can jump in and start if you want, or I can call on somebody.
I'll jump in on the water side. So it's I think it's a really important point, and at least particularly with water, it's a very place-based issue. And so, our hydrologic systems, our water cycles are dependent on like the local geography, soils, climate. And so dealing with water is effectively dealing with local conditions. And so, in Missouri, what we're trying to think about, and what people like the Nature Conservancy, for example, are trying to think about, is how do we adapt to these changes in climate? And the water situation in Missouri is pretty intense. And to give an example, over the past few decades, Missouri ranks 9th in terms of states in the amount of money that the FEMA flood insurance program has paid out. And we're number 1 in non-coastal states. So the top 8 are all coastal states that have dealt with coastal flooding, but Missouri is number 1 in terms of non-coastal states. So our water, our flooding issues are significant, and they're going to get worse. And so in terms of adaptation, we need to think about, well, how do we effectively buffer against climate change in a water landscape? And so, so it really comes back to understanding, the water cycle, and it comes a lot to vegetation and appropriate vegetation. So if we can revegetate the landscape, if we can think about ways to put, buffers along our rivers and not urbanize right up to the edge of rivers, not, conduct agriculture right up to the edge of rivers, to effectively slow the water down. And I still, I think about this time a couple of years ago where, I was fortunate enough to go to Costa Rica with my family, and it was pouring rain. We were in the rainforest part of the country, just for a day, and it's just an absolute deluge. And there was this stream we had to drive over to get to where we were staying. And I thought oh man, this is going to get rough. And the entire time we were there, the stream didn't go up at all. And it's because the vegetation was able to slow how that water was getting into the rivers. And we need to be really conscious about how we do that in Missouri, and we can do that. And it also translates to water temperature. And so air temperatures are increasing, water temperatures are going to increase. And we have things, referred to as the urban heat island, where urban areas are warmer than rural areas. And it's because of the amount of concrete and lack of vegetation. And so, some work we've done has shown that if you simply plant forests up to the edge of a river or a stream, you can lower the water temperature 3 degrees. And that's important because it preserves biodiversity. You don't get harmful algal blooms. You don't get, potential, bacterial outbreaks because of warmer temperatures. So, we need to think about our water systems as integrated with the entire landscape and understand how to use that landscape to best buffer against these increases in temperature and these deluges of precipitation we're going to experience.
Barbara, I think that's a perfect lead in to you, this connection with vegetation and kind of the larger ecosystem. Specifically, do you have specific Missouri or Midwest sort of thoughts or examples that you might want to build on here?
Absolutely. Before I go into some of the examples how things are changing, the issue of adaptation is really interesting. And I'll talk in a moment just a little bit about what native plants and animals have done. But there's other aspects of adaptation that deal with, for example, in agriculture, one of the things we worry about is a loss of soil fertility, adding lots and lots of fertilizer, and that causes all kinds of problems downstream. And there's all kinds of work in biotechnology and in bioinformatics, looking at the kinds of the microbiome that's around plants. There are various kinds of bacteria that are really good at gathering up nitrogen, and they're being developed to replace fertilizers, nitrogen fertilizers, so that we don't have runoff. And there's a lot of technological issues, technology that's going on right now to try to adapt and to really mitigate some of the effects of climate change. And I just wanted to put that out there. In terms of Missouri's native plants and animals, there's clearly been effects of climate change. As mean temperatures warm, we might expect to see, and we do see, shifts in animal and plant behavior, and some very first responses. And we see that now. For example, animals, reptiles hibernate. That's temperature dependent. So the time of hibernation is changing. Also, their reproduction, the hormonal cues are triggered by temperature. So those kinds of reproductive things have changed. Plants bud earlier. There's a study, a long-term study in the United Kingdom from the 1700s until now, and plants, native plants are flowering a month earlier. We see exactly the same thing in Missouri in Shaw Nature Reserve. That records from the 1930s indicate that plants were flowering about 3 weeks later than they are flowering now. And that's, again, a response to the changes in temperature. I think well known for anybody in Missouri, we're starting to see armadillos going up further north. In part, that's a natural dispersal, but it's also fueled by climate change. Armadillos' range is limited by cold weather. Scissors-tailed flycatchers in Kansas are much more common now. Kansas City has peregrine falcons year-round. We have Canada geese year-round, and that is an interesting story. They were nearly extinct to now flourishing as neighborhood pests. So these climate changes really do change the biota. The adaptation is not always possible, and that's one of the things that we worry about long-term. Sometimes there's no place for plants to go. As the soils change, they can't change their range further and further north because there's different soil types, different vectors, et cetera. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and this is something that Jason mentioned early on, and that is the variable climate. We had an example this season of some very cold weather. I think it was below zero. And then I think within about 8 days, we were up to the 60s. And this is really devastating for plants because they're getting these different kinds of cues. One is it's winter, don't open your buds. And then at 60 degrees, that indicates springtime. We're worried about insects coming out too soon. That's a temperature dependent response, but birds migrating may be more day length. And so there can be this loss of synchrony between when the caterpillars and the grubs and everything are available for insects, for birds for their reproduction, but now the temperature, the synchrony is a little bit off. So these are some really interesting things, lots of adaptation, but we worry about the long-term adaptation.
This unpredictability is very hard for systems, right? It's one thing to just change to something new. It's another thing to have the unpredictability during the adaptation phase. And certainly we're going to lose things, and we're going to lose important things. I think that's a really interesting point, Barbara. Wyatt, do you have thoughts on this too? We also have some questions coming in. I just will encourage folks to take a look at on impacts on infrastructure and energy, and Jason, a very specific one in there for you on like the role of the Army Corps of Engineers. So maybe after Wyatt, you talk a little bit about Missouri and food. If you've got thoughts on these other things as well, throw them in, and then we may throw it back to Jason.
Sure. So thank you again. So certainly the sorts of weather extremes of heavy precipitation, drought, lots of heat, too little heat, these things affect crop production, obviously, and crop production has always been sensitive to varying degrees to these things. There can be too little water, too much. It can be too little heat, too much, and it depends on when the growing season. So yes, those sensitivities are there, and that can be production risks. Also for livestock, the same things that Barbara describes affecting animals can affect livestock too, and affect agriculture that way and food supplies. Of course, Jason is very nice to stress for the audience, for all of us, that water is critical and a steady supply of water flow, I almost said, water is critical. But we often think of food as also a high priority thing, but the big difference is that food is a basket of possibilities in which each of us has our preferences, each of us sees different prices, we can choose among things. And to meet that food goal, we might have lots of options. And here in Missouri, we don't just eat what we produce. A great deal of our food comes from other places, and we export a lot of food ingredients as well and food products. So when we think about food security in Missouri, we might think, well, it's a part of a bigger food market and global commodity markets. And we also might pause to think that if in the US as a whole, on average, people spend maybe 10% of their income or so on food, that for most people in Missouri, it's not free, but it's not the most challenging thing, or as challenging as it is in some other countries, or for some people in particular, some more vulnerable groups. And so to some extent, as long as people can substitute within their food, maybe they can manage a certain degree of risk to the food supplies overall. And but that's not always true. There are people who are vulnerable. The US, at least, we do have programs, for food assistance, including the SNAP program that targets some of those people. With no program's perfect, no solution's perfect, but there are some programs like that that actually target food security, or insecurity rather, here in Missouri and in the United States. But that's only of course, in some people's minds, that will only go so far. It's focused on the US. There might be broader international questions. But certainly the risks to food security there, there's the production risk from this that's in the US, there's the broader risks to production globally, and certainly there's the risk of food market impacts and food price impacts.
One other, I guess, question that comes to mind on this, Wyatt, is the role of kind of more visibility of local food production. I think that over the last 20 years, we've certainly seen a rise of farmers markets, more co-ops, direct purchasing. I'm curious as to your thoughts on that as part of the mix, and how you feel like that may or may not play a useful role in what I think for many decades, kind of post-World War II, was pushed to be a much more globalized system, where in fact we were not necessarily producing locally and buying locally as much.
My understanding is that the shares of those sorts of foods in total consumption still isn't very large, that most of the food people eat is not produced locally, and that most people, a great majority of their consumption of most things comes from a broader network. And moreover, the desire to put a premium on maybe some of the quality attributes that come with a local purchase might not be the priorities for someone who's on a tighter budget. And when we think about food insecurity and maybe vulnerable populations, I don't know where necessarily if we think of those people getting food at the local farmers market as the cheapest source of food for somebody on a tight budget. Some do, I'm not saying otherwise, but I don't think that's the main place. This isn't my normal area of study, so I have to be very cautious there. But those are my impressions that yes, there's more local purchasing of food, but still not a majority. The majority still comes from commercially produced and often very large scale practices that are professionally managed and have capital behind them, and not a nuclear engineer or something, Melissa, who runs it, but actually a person who's studied agriculture and agribusiness quite carefully.
I think it's really just an important point to make, in that I do think local food security is really tightly coupled not only to national food security, but also to global food security. And so I kind of want us to make sure that even though we want to talk about these things in a local context or a Missouri context, we can't escape the fact that these systems, we are locally dependent on things that are far outside of our control. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, the risk to Missouri producers might be as much from the price risk caused by shocks in other parts of the world as from domestic production risk.
Absolutely. Jason, perhaps you want to talk a little bit about the sort of Army Corps of Engineers, and then Barbara, if you have thoughts maybe on the energy and infrastructure question of sort of how we see the impacts happening there. It was interested in how climate change affects infrastructure and those implications for national security. And they use the case of like Texas Grid in 2021 as an example. I'm not, if it's not your bailiwick, I don't need to put you on the spot. I assumed that PCAST would give you a little bit of that. Your role at PCAST would give you a little access to that.
Okay, I'll jump in on the question about water and the Army Corps of Engineers. And so for those of you who don't see it in the chat, the question was, how does the interconnectedness of the Missouri River related to transport, conservation, flood control, et cetera, relate to priorities of the Army Corps of Engineers in a changing climate? And so I think, so I'm probably going to dodge this question a little bit in the sense that, I mean, I think the Army Corps of Engineers generally has a job to do, and they do that job. And I think there's a perception that the Army Corps of Engineers goes in and brute forces an issue related to infrastructure and water. And in many ways, those projects are not decided by the Army Corps of Engineers. That, you know, they're given a task and they have a set of tools to complete that task, and they do it, and they do it well. But I think we need to step back and decide, you know, in a broader context, how we view adaptation to climate in terms of our water resources, and then in that light, provide, you know, groups like the Army Corps of Engineers the information that they need to effectively manage our water systems. And so I always am concerned about putting too much on a single group or a single answer in terms of climate. I think we need to sort of fundamentally rethink the ways that we deal with our environmental systems and give, you know, agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers the information they need. And I think part of that responsibility, you know, falls on the academic community. And I think the academic community needs to fundamentally change the way they operate. And I think we need to become more engaged with agencies like the Army Corps of Engineers, so they have the tools, the most up-to-date tools, the most up-to-date information they need to provide appropriate management of our freshwater resources. I mean, I think that we, you know, we're all in this together, and we can't look to the Army Corps to solve our problems. We can't look to, you know, NGOs to solve our problems. We all need to be engaged and put our strengths forward to help with this issue. And whether, you know, I'm a hydrologist, freshwater scientist, whether that means me doing research that engages the federal government, or, you know, somebody who's, you know, doing something different, that they get out and vote. That they vote in a way that provides, you know, solutions to climate issues. So, I mean, the Army Corps has a role, but I think we all have a role to inform the Army Corps of what they're doing and how they can manage our systems.
This answer is really near and dear to my heart, Jason, and I really appreciate that. I think as someone who spent almost my entire career working for the military, I always wish that we had more interstitial sort of spaces that connected the basic research and the intellectual communities that we have in academia that are like the envy of the world, and the really practical on the ground solutions that are needed in the world that don't draw prestige, and they don't get published in Nature magazine, and they don't necessarily get funded by the National Science Foundation. They're not quite as sexy, but like finding some way to begin to really bring our intellectual heft to local problems, to problems that aren't always going to be one size fits all, that aren't always going to scale to the entire world or the entire country, which seems to be what philanthropies like to fund. And so I think it's really important for us to have these conversations about bringing some agency and autonomy and personal responsibility into solving some of these problems. And I'm interested in solutions that get us closer to this intersection, and I love hearing that. Barbara.
I'm not even close to an expert on energy infrastructure.
You can also punt. You don't have to answer it.
No, but actually, I think this is a very interesting thing that Laura has brought up. And the Texas situation, from the little that I know, is that it was kind of a unique situation in that most of our energy infrastructure, our grid, goes beyond one state, and that there are these very large sections, and that there's backup, and people have really thought about what happens when part of a grid goes out and how can you shunt power to different places. Texas had its own grid, And I know that in fact that had been told in the past to modernize, but didn't. And it brings, and that then led to this this massive shutdown and the real problems that the loss of electricity had for many, many Texans. But there's some real principles here, and that's the idea that when we have climate change, these kinds of extreme events are going to happen. So in the past, maybe some organizations, some institutions could dodge the bullet, but it's going to be harder and harder to do that now, because we have not only increasing the variability, the number of events, but also the intensity of the events. And so there needs to be this general issue about buffering and making sure that there's backup when a local area does have one of these intense ice storms or whatever. Part of it also is to make sure that organizations, businesses understand that there are varying rewards and goals. That a goal might be to have profit, but in order to really maintain that profit, one has to think about climate change and has to think about sustainability of supply chain of the electrical grid. And just to the same point that Jason made, it's not just one agency, it's not just one group of regulators, but there needs to be sort of a coming together to understand the kinds of new contingencies that climate change is going to impact us. So it's actually a very interesting question.
And can I jump in on that? Just to build on what Barbara was saying in the context of Missouri and energy, my understanding is that 75% of our electrical energy comes from coal. And we are number 2 behind West Virginia in terms of the amount of coal that is dedicated to our energy system. And there's just a study that came out, I think, in the past day or two, showing that 99% of green energy generation or plants in the US is more cost effective than coal. And so in terms of resilience in our energy systems, I mean, diversifying is obvious, but that we're sort of number 2 on coal is, that is an issue in Missouri that we need to deal with and is, critical and frankly, like a little embarrassing.
All right, so we're going to kind of start bringing this to an end, and I want to get some takeaways from you guys. I certainly have a few myself. I do want to throw out this last question that we got in the chat, talking about how can we encourage cooperation between corporations and I would say other actors in the system, in that it feels like we kind of know what we need to do and even how we need to do it. I would argue that may not always be the case. It's a pretty diverse landscape, but how do we actually convince folks to do it, and kind of what's the role for students and being able to figure that out? So maybe any thoughts you have on that, but also just what are kind of the takeaways you want to leave folks with today as we wrap this up. So maybe Wyatt, we could start with you.
Sure. Yeah, so there's a lot to wrap up. So it's a huge topic, right? And you think about other big shocks, we mentioned the pandemic, the trade war, whatever, and even what we've already seen so far in terms of changing weather patterns and those impacts. And a lot of the changes that happen, but because people choose them, because the incentives are there and they make those choices. And so then we think about the longer term going forward and the risks there. And are people making steps now to think about what they'll be? Are seed companies investing in the sorts of technologies and seeds that can handle some of the weather extremes that have been discussed? And are there new areas there? Are machinery companies trying to make new machines that can handle some of the challenges, that can work faster or do bigger or better? So what's going on there? And if not, why not? Is it because of lack of certainty about what those events will be in the future and how it affects their business? And this sort of link between the science of long-term climate change impacts and decisions people can make now and incentives they have now seems an interesting place for someone to be who's thinking about how this happens, what they could do, where the gaps are. To me, that's, we've seen people adapt to huge shocks. And here we are expecting, according to, as Jason Barber said, climate scientists tell us, expect big shocks. So are there reasons why those expected big shocks haven't manifested in the form of changes soon, or are they already happening and we just don't see them because they're in the works? And to me, these are some of the interesting questions to consider. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Jason?
Sure. Yeah, I think the important thing to think about is compromise and cooperation. And it seems like a difficult thing to hope for, but I think it's fundamentally important because, I think the majority of people, like literally the majority, need to be on board with dealing with issues related to climate change. And I think, many of us here probably recognize the ways to combat climate change and what we need to do. But I think fundamentally what we need to convey to a lot of people is frankly like how economically harmful climate change is going to be to us, and the benefits of moving forward, whether it be with like a green economy or green energy infrastructure, or the damaging impacts of floods to our homeowners insurance, those types of things. I mean, I think there are some obvious answers to this, but I think, in reality, if we can start letting people know about the real economic disadvantages of a changing climate and how hard it's going to make things on the average family, I think that is something that we also need to really think about.
Thank you, Jason. Barbara?
I couldn't agree more with both Jason and Wyatt. I wanted to end on a somewhat more positive note and some things that Missouri actually does well in terms of the biodiversity. The Missouri Department of Natural Resources, conservation groups do a fantastic job. And the fact that Missouri takes some of the gasoline tax and puts it into natural resources has allowed a lot of areas to be preserved. And we really have done a good job maintaining a lot of ecosystem services. Likewise, the Missouri chapter of the Nature Conservancy has worked really hard, not only to preserve some very unique sites that are in Missouri. Missouri has fantastic biodiversity, but also they're looking at things like how you can maintain a forest, even harvest some of the forest and still maintain the biodiversity of it. And then finally, there's lots of opportunities in terms of citizen science, working all the way from Forest Park to some of our state parks, lots of opportunities for students and locals as well. So obviously when we look at the future of climate change, it's absolutely critical, but there are also a lot of folks that are really looking at it. And Missouri, in fact, in many ways has been a leader in a couple of those areas.
Thank you so much. I think all of you have given me a little bit of a takeaway of the reality that this is a very decentralized system and very connected. And I loved the comment that was made, I think by you, Wyatt, that it's not designed, it's organized, right? You said that about the food system, but I think this says a lot about our country as well, that it's not a designed system, it's sort of a loosely organized system. We're very decentralized. The chances that someone is going to swoop in and from the top down dictate a solution to climate change and to all of the impacts is very low, which is why each of us kind of have the opportunity to be part of the resilience, part of the adaptation. And so I guess one thing I would just say to the students that are on the call, and I think some of the younger people who may feel overwhelmed by climate change as a topic, is that leaning in and doing what you can actually matters more than it might feel like. Every small solution is a part of aggregating to a larger adaptation. And so as much as you can, not being overwhelmed by it, but in fact, leaning into it as something positive to do something local and something small, I think really matters. And I think all of the folks on this call would say there are lots of people like us whose doors are open to have conversations about these things. So don't feel like you're despair, right? There are a lot of ways to lean into this in positive ways. And so I hope that you hear that and feel that and reach out. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Zach and say a huge thank you for the opportunity to be here. I hope that I can meet you all in person. I think we have some incredible resources in Missouri.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and to Jason, Barbara, and Wyatt for being a part of this call. I just wanted to take a brief moment to point people to our website. One of the main things that we offer to legislators are what are called science notes, and legislators reach out to us to ask us about information on particular policy topics. And I just wanted to point people there because many of the topics that were brought up today, including food security and water resilience, are topics that Missouri legislators are thinking about and have reached out to us to do research on, and we have published research on that that is available on our website, free to the public. As we are wrapping up, I just dropped into the chat a short evaluation. Data that you all can offer us will help us to make these roundtables better for the future. So please do take a couple minutes to fill that out if you can. And looking forward, our next roundtable will be again co-hosted with the WashU Climate Change Program. It will be in March about regenerative agriculture. So a huge thanks again to Melissa, Jason, Barbara, and Wyatt. It's great to hear you all speak today and really appreciate it. And with that, we will close out the call. Thank you very much.
Thank you.